That's right. And look, if we were to, so, the first book, The Challenger Sale, is about this problem of customers learning on their own. And what do the best salespeople do in a world where customers are learning on their own? What we wrote about is that they bring the thing that the customer couldn't learn on their own. So they focus less on asking the customer what's keeping you up at night. They focus more on showing the customer what should be keeping them up at night. Now, this new book, The JOLT Effect, is really about this problem of customer indecision. So what happens when the customer says, Nick, I'm sold. Like I am convinced that the way we do things today, it's suboptimal. If you've created a burning platform, I'm jumping off. I'm abandoning ship. And you've showed me that your solution, your product, your service is what I should buy, because it's going to make all this problem go away. It's going to make things a lot better for me. It could be, if you're a consumer, for my family, for my finances. If you're a business leader, for our profitability, for our risk exposure, it's going to solve all these problems. I'm with you. Let's talk turkey. Let's start talking about an agreement. And what often happens in sales is that between that point where the customer says they're on board, they start kind of talking themselves out of it. They start, they get cold feet. They start hemming and hawing. They stop showing up for Zoom calls, for demos. They start, the time lag between their email responses gets longer and longer, and those responses get more curt and more curt as they go. And they start wringing their hands and wondering, like, am I actually making the right decision here? And what's so interesting is that in sales, for, I would say forever, really, but at least for the past 40, 50 years, the conventional wisdom of sales has been that the only reason a customer gets cold feet after they've agreed to move forward with the purchase is because you haven't put their status quo to bed. You have not beaten their status quo. You haven't shown them that what they're doing today is clearly suboptimal. You haven't created that burning platform. Maybe you haven't convinced them that your product or service is a much more compelling alternative, or maybe they're not convinced that the change journey is worth it, right? It's going to be a lot of time and energy, and is it really worth it? And you haven't overcome that inaction inertia. So, but it's got to be one of those reasons. And so what happens is you get these customers who have cold feet, and salespeople go around like with their beat the status quo hammer, and they just like, every indecisive customer looks like a nail. And what we found in the research is that more often than not, going back to try to create that burning platform, dial up the FUD, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, make the customer squirm a bit, show them the cost of their inaction, or to try to reconvince them of all the benefits of your product and your service and your solution, all that stuff actually ends up making the situation worse, not better. And that was puzzling to us. In fact, we found it was an 84% probability that doing the thing that we've been taught to do for decades now actually will backfire. It'll make it more likely the customer does nothing. And it wasn't clear why until we kind of started peeling apart the data a bit. And what we realized is we had to kind of ask a bigger question, which was, what would motivate a customer to do nothing? And what we found is there's actually two discrete drivers of inaction. The first one is the one we're all familiar with, which is they prefer their status quo. They think what they're doing today is good enough. They don't think your solution's a compelling enough reason to change. It's not a superior alternative, or it is superior, but not in a demonstrably compelling way. They haven't been convinced that the change journey is worth it. So, but we've always been taught that, again, if they get cold feet, it's because they're still wedded to their status quo. You got to beat on the status quo. You got to put it to bed. But what we found is there's a second type of no decision loss, and that's not preference for the status quo. That's actually indecision about how to change it or whether to change it. And that those things might sound the same, but let me explain to you how they're different. If you look at indecision, it turns out it's a function of three specific things. The first one is what we call valuation problems. So this is a customer who's looking at a lot of options that the salesperson's put in front of them, and they're saying these all sound great. And they're afraid of choosing the wrong one. And if they choose the wrong one, that could become an irreversible decision. And again, they've got egg on their face because they picked option B. They should have picked option A. They screwed up, and that's bad for them. The second source of indecision is a lack of information. This is what we were talking about before, Nick. The customer who feels like they haven't done enough homework, they haven't done enough research, and it's the next white paper they read that's going to lay bare all of the things they need to know before they make this big weighty decision. The third source of indecision is what we call outcome uncertainty. This is where the customer feels like they're not going to get what they're paying for. Not that you're not going to deliver the product or service. It's more that they won't achieve the benefits that you have described to them and the ones you've projected with your ROI calculation, the ones that you used or that your business case is predicated upon, right? When you went to the CFO's office and you asked for budget, those outcomes, you're signing up to deliver those outcomes. And it's the customer worried that I'm taking a leap of faith here. And what if this thing goes sideways? And if it goes sideways, best case, I have egg on my face. Worst case, I could get fired for this, right? And especially that becomes especially hard for these customers as we enter into potentially an economic downturn, right? More scrutiny, more eyes on big decisions, more hemming and hawing, more consternation. That outcome uncertainty really starts to weigh on our customers. So those three things, I'm going to pick the wrong option. I haven't done enough homework. I might not get what I'm paying for. Those three things have nothing to do with the status quo. They're not about the status quo. And you could easily have a customer who says, Nick, I'm with you. What we do today stinks. I want to move forward with you. But which version of your solution? Have I done enough homework? And have you given me any guarantee of success that we're going to achieve these outcomes that you've painted for me? That helps explain why when you go back and you treat every indecisive customer like a nail and you just beat them with your status quo hammer, those things can actually backfire when the customer's not actually wedded to their status quo. They're worried about something else. And what they're worried about, as you said before, Nick, is that personal fear of failure. I am going to look bad and I might put myself in jeopardy if I don't do all my due diligence and consume as much content as possible, do all my homework. If I choose the wrong thing from among a bunch of options that look great, and if I don't negotiate with this vendor to get any kind of safety net, any assurance that this is all going to pay off, if I don't do those things, that's going to be bad for me. And so those are the things that turns out when we do the math, it's indecision about changing the status quo is actually the bigger driver of deals lost to no decision. It's not preference for the status quo. Preference for the status quo is only about 44% of no decision losses. 56% of the time, the customer agrees the status quo stinks and they're ready to move forward, but instead they're struggling with one of those three fears of failure that we just talked about.